My mother didn't even lower her voice. "Rowena, take him out of the picture. He'll ruin the whole thing." The photographer paused mid-adjustment of his tripod, clearly unsure whether he should pretend not to hear. My father gestured impatiently for me to move, waving his hand like he was shooing away a stray animal. My son Milo pressed himself into my hip, his small hand gripping my sweater, confused and frightened by the sudden shift in the room's energy. I felt heat rush up my throat, my muscles locked in place. Every part of me wanted to scream, to defend him, to make them see what they were doing. "He's just standing here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My mother leaned in close, her teeth clenched behind her smile. "He draws attention. You know how he is. Please don't make a scene in front of everyone." The extended family stood arranged behind us in careful poses, aunts, uncles, cousins, all watching this moment unfold with uncomfortable silence. Nobody defended us. Nobody said a word. My name is Rowena Vale, and it was in that moment, with my child being treated like a stain on their perfect portrait, that something inside me snapped clean in half. I'd spent years making excuses for them, hoping they'd change, believing family meant unconditional love. I was done believing. I took Milo's hand and walked out of that room without a single backward glance. The sound of chairs scraping against hardwood followed us. Whispers rose like a tide behind me. I heard my sister's muffled laugh, that familiar sound she made when she thought someone was being overdramatic. Outside, the November air slapped my face cold and sharp. My breath came out in white clouds. Milo looked up at me with those wide brown eyes that saw everything, understood more than people gave him credit for. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. My heart broke in a way I didn't know it still could. I'd thought years of defending him, of fighting for his place in this family, had toughened me against this kind of pain. But hearing him blame himself for their cruelty was a wound that cut deeper than anything they'd said to me directly. "No, baby," I told him, kneeling down to his level right there on the front lawn. "You didn't do anything wrong, not one single thing." But the truth sat like a stone in my chest, heavy and immovable. My family didn't just exclude him from a photograph. They wanted him hidden. They wanted him erased. They were ashamed of the beautiful child I'd been given. That wasn't even the first time they'd shown their true colors. Years earlier, right after Milo's diagnosis at age 3, my mother had sat across from me at her pristine kitchen table and asked if I'd ever considered a long-term care facility for him. She said it gently, like she was suggesting I try a new hairstyle or a different brand of coffee. Her voice was soft and reasonable, the way you'd speak to someone you were trying to convince without upsetting them. "There are wonderful places," she'd continued when I didn't respond immediately. "Professional care, round-the-clock supervision. You could visit him on weekends." My father had nodded from his chair by the window, as if this were common sense, as if every parent facing challenges simply handed their children over to strangers and moved on with their lives. I remember gripping my coffee mug so tightly the ceramic cracked in my hand. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Hot liquid spilled across the table, and my mother had jumped up with a cloth, more concerned about her tablecloth than the fact that she just suggested I give away my son. I should have known then. I should have recognized that moment as the beginning of the end. But I kept hoping they'd love him the way I did. 3 days after the disastrous family photo incident, my mother called. "You embarrassed the entire family," she said without preamble, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Walking out like that in front of everyone. Cousin Helena drove 2 hours to be there. Uncle Marcus brought his new wife. What must they think of us now?" Not a word about Milo, not an apology for what she'd said, just concern about appearances and reputation. "I want you to come back this weekend," she continued. "We'll retake the photos for the sake of family unity." She talked for 15 minutes about reputation, what relatives would say, how perception mattered in our community. She used words like togetherness and healing and moving forward. She spoke about tradition and legacy and the importance of presenting a united front. Never once did she say Milo's name. "I'm tired," I finally said, cutting through her monologue. "I'm tired of pretending we're all close when you can't even look at my son without flinching." She acted like I'd slapped her. Her voice went cold and clipped. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Rowena. You've become so bitter." It was the moment I decided I'd stop expecting anything from them. I'd stop hopping. I'd stop waiting. I'd stop breaking my heart against their indifference. I returned to reality that night. My reality, not theirs. Double shifts at the county hospital, working as a medical records clerk. Aching feet from standing all day. The quiet, constant fear of missing something important in Milo's life because I was always working, always exhausted, always trying to keep us afloat financially. Before heading out for my evening shift, I tucked Milo into bed. He handed me a drawing he'd made during his after-school program, a picture of two stick figures holding hands, one tall and one small. He'd colored our hair carefully, brown for me and black for him. At the top, in his careful printing, he'd written, "Mom plus me." "So you remember I'm always with you," he said, his voice already drowsy. I carried that drawing in my work bag for years after that night. It lived in the inside pocket, folded carefully, the edges wearing soft from being touched. Whenever I felt like giving up, during the hardest shifts, the loneliest moments, the times when the weight of single parenthood felt unbearable, I'd pull it out and look at it. That drawing reminded me what all this exhaustion was for. It reminded me why I worked until my bones felt hollow and my eyes burned with fatigue. I was building a life where nobody would ever try to shove him out of the frame again. 2 months after the photo disaster, my family invited us to dinner. They called it a peace offering. My sister even sent a text. "We miss you guys. Let's put all this behind us." I should have known better. I should have recognized the setup. But part of me, some small, stubborn part, still hoped they'd apologized, that they'd seen how wrong they'd been. Instead, dinner turned into an ambush. An intervention, they called it. "You're shutting yourself off from the people who care about you," my mother began once the main course was served. "You're isolating yourself and Milo. That's not healthy." My father chimed in. "You're making parenting harder than it needs to be. There are resources available." "Like that facility we mentioned," my mother interrupted, as if I'd somehow forgotten that conversation. My sister leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Are you ashamed to ask for help? Because that's what it looks like you're too proud to admit you can't handle this alone." I set down my fork carefully. My hands were shaking. "Handle what exactly?" I asked. "Loving my son, being his mother, which part am I not handling?" Nobody answered. They just exchanged those meaningful looks they were so good at, the ones that said they knew better, that I was being difficult. I left before dessert was served, with Milo's hand in mine. The breaking point came 3 weeks later with a medical bill I couldn't ignore. Milo needed to continue with an intensive therapy program that had been helping him tremendously. His speech had improved. His fine motor skills were developing. His therapists were optimistic about his progress. Then the insurance company denied coverage. The appeals process had failed. The cost was $800 a month, money I simply didn't have. I spent an entire night sitting in the dark living room after Milo fell asleep, staring at that bill, feeling like the worst kind of failure. The numbers blurred together. My chest felt tight. I couldn't breathe properly. My coworkers at the hospital had told me to swallow my pride and ask my parents for help. "They're your family," one of them said. "That's what family does." But I already knew how that conversation would go. They'd offer money, but it would come with conditions. Suggestions about how I should be parenting. Reminders of how much they were sacrificing to help me. Comments about the care facility again. Every dollar would have strings attached that would strangle me. I'd spent years learning that their help always came with a price I couldn't afford to pay. So I made a different choice. I decided to build something they couldn't take away from me. Every night after Milo fell asleep, I opened my laptop and studied. I enrolled in free online courses about business management, grant writing, nonprofit administration, anything I could learn that might open doors for us. I wanted to understand funding systems, community programs, resources that people like me weren't supposed to have access to. I wanted to provide for Milo, without relying on a family that made me feel like a burden every time I asked for anything. Those late nights were brutal. I'd work my shift at the hospital, come home exhausted, get Milo through dinner and homework and bath time, and then sit at the kitchen table half asleep over spreadsheets and coursework until 2 a.m. Some mornings, I woke up with my face pressed against the keyboard, my neck aching, barely enough time to shower and get Milo ready for school. But slowly, page by page, course by course, I was building knowledge that nobody could take from me. I was learning skills that would change our lives. Every certificate I earned felt like a small victory. Every assignment I completed was proof that I was more than they'd ever given me credit for. Those late nights, fighting to keep my eyes open while everyone else slept, were the first steps toward our new life. The life I was going to build for us. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. During one of Milo's occupational therapy sessions, his therapist asked me to step into her office. Her name was Carmen, and she'd been working with Milo for 6 months. I braced myself for bad news. I'd gotten used to conversations that started with concerned expressions and careful words. "I wanted to talk to you about something remarkable I've noticed," Carmen said, pulling out a folder of worksheets. "Milo has an extraordinary talent for visual pattern recognition." She spread the papers across her desk. Activities where Milo had identified complex sequences, matched intricate designs, organized shapes and colors in ways that revealed underlying structures. "He sees things in patterns and sequences that adults with advanced training rarely notice," she continued. "The way his brain processes visual information is genuinely exceptional. This isn't just about completing assignments. He's demonstrating a cognitive strength that could be developed into real skills." I stared through the glass window into the therapy room where Milo was working with an assistant, arranging colored blocks into an elaborate pattern. He moved with quiet confidence, completely absorbed in the task. It was the first time in years that someone had talked about his abilities instead of his limitations. The first time someone saw potential instead of problems. I cried in Carmen's office that day, overwhelmed by hope I'd forgotten I was allowed to feel. 3 months later, a small nonprofit took a chance on me. The Community Connections Center served underprivileged families in our area, connecting them with resources, running after-school programs, organizing support groups. They needed someone to help with administrative work, organizing events, managing schedules, basic grant applications. The pay was barely above minimum wage. The hours were part-time and irregular, but it was a foot in the door. More importantly, it was teaching me skills I couldn't learn in any classroom. Real-world experience in scheduling, budgeting, grant writing, community outreach, program development. I soaked up everything like a sponge. I volunteered for extra projects. I asked questions until my supervisor probably got tired of answering. I studied how successful programs were structured, how funding worked, how to write proposals that actually got approved. My family thought it was a waste of time. "You could be making more money at a corporate job," my sister said when she found out. "Why are you working at some charity?" But she didn't understand. This wasn't just about money. This was about building a foundation, creating a path, learning how to advocate not just for Milo, but for every family like ours that got dismissed and overlooked. Every task, no matter how small, felt like I was opening a door. 6 months into my work at the Community Connections Center, I secured my first grant. It was small, $5,000 for a summer program serving kids with developmental disabilities. But I'd written the proposal myself, researched the funding source, made the pitch, and gotten it approved. When the approval letter arrived with my name on it, I stood in the office holding the paper and couldn't stop staring at it. My name, my work, my achievement. I taped that letter inside my closet at home, where I could see it every morning when I got dressed. Some people might have framed it and hung it in a public place, but I wanted it private. I wanted it to be mine, something that reminded me every single day that I was building something real. Milo celebrated like I'd won an international award. He made me a certificate on construction paper that said Best Mom with drawings of stars all around it. We went to the ice cream shop near our apartment and got sundaes with extra toppings, splurging on something we usually couldn't afford. "We're winning, Mom," Milo said, chocolate sauce on his chin, his smile bright and genuine. For the first time in years, I felt something rising in me that wasn't just exhaustion or determination. It was confidence, the real kind, the kind that comes from actually accomplishing something on your own terms. As I worked and learned and grew, Milo kept developing too. His pattern recognition skills that Carmen had identified continued to strengthen. In therapy, he graduated to increasingly complex visual puzzles and organizational tasks. At home, he'd arrange his books by color and size, organize my scattered papers into neat systems, sort laundry with a precision that amazed me. One evening, I was struggling with a filing system for the community center, trying to organize hundreds of participant forms in a way that made sense. I'd been at it for 2 hours, getting increasingly frustrated. Milo wandered over from his homework and studied my mess of papers spread across our small dining table. "Can I help?" he asked. I almost said no. I didn't want to burden him with my work problems, but something made me pause. "Sure, baby. Any ideas?" He looked at the forms for maybe 30 seconds, then started sorting them by color-coded categories I'd marked in the corners. But he didn't just sort them. He created a visual system, arranging them in a way that showed connections and patterns I'd completely missed. Within 20 minutes, he'd turned my chaos into perfect order. I stood there stunned, watching him work with that same quiet focus I'd seen through Carmen's window. "It just makes sense like this," he said with a shrug, like it was obvious. That's when I realized the world had no idea what my son was capable of. When word started spreading that I was moving up at the community center, taking on bigger projects, getting my name on grant approvals, building a reputation in the nonprofit sector, my family suddenly became interested in our lives again. Not to apologize, not to acknowledge how they'd treated us, to gossip and undermine. My sister called one evening and spent 20 minutes talking around what she really wanted to say before finally getting to the point. "Mom says you're trying to make yourself look better than everyone. Working at that charity, acting like you're some kind of community hero." "I'm not acting like anything," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm just doing my job." "Well, it comes across as judgmental, like you think you're better than us because we have normal jobs." My mother left a voicemail suggesting I was being selfish by refusing to attend family gatherings. "You're teaching Milo to hold grudges," she said. "That's not healthy for a child." The irony was stunning. They'd excluded him from family photos, suggested I put him in a facility, made him feel unwanted. But I was the one being unhealthy by keeping distance. "I'm not avoiding them," I told my friend Keisha at work when she asked why I looked stressed. "I just don't feel small anymore when I'm away from them." That was the truth. Without their constant criticism and suggestions and subtle put-downs, I discovered who I actually was. And I liked that person. The real turning point came when I applied for a professional development program. It was run by a state university, designed for people working in nonprofit leadership who wanted to level up their skills. The program was intensive, 8 months of weekend classes, networking opportunities, mentorship with established leaders in the field. The application required essays, references, a detailed plan for how I'd apply what I learned. I wrote that application with tears in my eyes, sitting at my kitchen table after Milo went to bed, pouring everything I'd learned and suffered and hoped for onto those pages. The acceptance rate was less than 20%. Most applicants had graduate degrees and years more experience than me. When the acceptance letter arrived, with a full scholarship covering the entire program. I sat on my kitchen floor and cried until Milo found me and wrapped his arms around my neck. "Mom, are you sad?" he asked, worried. "No, baby," I held him tight. "We're winning, we're actually winning." He pulled back and looked at me seriously. "I knew we would. You work really hard." That scholarship changed everything. It opened doors I'd thought were permanently locked. It connected me with people who saw potential instead of problems. It was the beginning of something I'd barely let myself imagine was possible. The next 3 years were a blur of quiet, determined work. I completed the professional development program while working full-time. I built networks and skills and a reputation in the nonprofit sector. I focused on programs serving families with children who had disabilities, kids like Milo who deserved advocates who understood their lives from the inside. I avoided my parents almost entirely. Birthday cards, nothing more. Polite distance that protected both Milo and me from their particular brand of caring that felt more like criticism. I didn't want Milo learning their language of shame. I didn't want him internalizing their belief that he was somehow less than, that he needed to be hidden or fixed or managed. Our home became a sanctuary, small but peaceful. We had routines that worked for us. Dinners at the table where we talked about our days, weekends at the library and the park, movie nights with popcorn on the couch. Milo thrived in the stability I'd created. His reading improved. His confidence grew. He made friends at school, real friends who valued him. For the first time in his life, nobody was telling him he didn't belong. For the first time in mine, I wasn't fighting just to prove we deserved to exist. We were building something beautiful in the space their rejection had created. The moment that changed our trajectory happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was working on a spreadsheet for a community workshop, trying to organize registration data for 200 participants into a format that made sense. Hours of work, and I was getting nowhere. The data was scattered, inconsistent, impossible to track. Milo wandered over from his homework, drawn by my frustrated muttering. "Can I see?" he asked. I turned the laptop toward him without much hope. It was complex data with multiple variables. He studied the screen for maybe 2 minutes, his eyes moving across the rows and columns in that focused way I'd come to recognize. Then he started rearranging things. He color-coded entries I'd been treating as separate categories. He reorganized the structure to show patterns I'd completely missed. He created a visual system that made the relationships between different data points immediately clear. In 15 minutes, he transformed my incomprehensible mess into something elegant and functional. I sat there absolutely stunned, watching his hands move confidently across the keyboard. "It just makes sense like this," he said again, that same phrase he'd used years ago, like it was obvious, like anyone would see it this way. "Milo," I said slowly, "what you just did, that's not normal. That's exceptional." He looked at me with surprise. "Really?" "Really?" That night, I contacted Carmen and told her what I'd witnessed. "We need to explore this further," she said immediately. 3 months later, everything accelerated. My work at the community center had caught the attention of a larger organization, a statewide nonprofit focused on accessible technology for youth with disabilities. They were launching a new initiative and needed someone to lead program development. The job was a massive step up, real salary, benefits, the chance to impact hundreds of families across multiple communities. The interview was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Not because of the questions, but because of what it represented. This was the future I'd been building toward, the door I'd been trying to open for years. When they offered me the position 2 weeks later, I cried in my car for 20 minutes before driving home to tell Milo. "We did it," I told him, both of us celebrating in our small kitchen. "Everything we worked for, it's happening." But there was more. At my first major event in the new role, I brought Milo with me. During a break between sessions, one of the tech consultants noticed him quietly using design software on my laptop, something he'd been teaching himself for months. She watched him work for 5 minutes without interrupting. Then she approached me, her eyes wide. "That child sees in algorithms," she said. "The way he's processing visual information and translating it into digital design, that's not something you can teach. That's how his brain works." She asked if she could mentor him. Through tears, I said yes. Around this same time, my parents started reaching out again. Suddenly, after 3 years of minimal contact, they became very interested in our lives. Messages appeared on my phone. "We've been thinking about you. It's been too long. Family shouldn't stay apart like this." Calls came, my mother's voice warm and sweet, asking about Milo, wondering when we'd visit, suggesting we come to Sunday dinner like old times. My sister sent lengthy texts about how much she missed us, how the family wasn't complete without us. It was all so transparent, it almost made me laugh. They'd heard about my new position from neighbors who'd seen the announcement in the local paper. They'd learned from relatives that Milo was getting recognition for his work with the tech consultant. Suddenly, we were worth acknowledging again. Suddenly, we belonged in their world. But only now that we'd achieved things they could brag about to others. Not when we needed them, not when Milo was small and struggling and they suggested I hide him away. Only now, when we'd built something impressive without them. I responded politely but distantly, made vague promises about getting together, sometime soon, that I had no intention of keeping. I wasn't angry anymore. I just didn't need their validation. We'd learned to thrive in their absence. 6 months into my new position, Milo was invited to present at a community technology showcase. It was a small event, maybe 100 people, focused on innovative approaches to accessibility and inclusive design. Milo had been working with his mentor on a visual data organization system that helped people with processing difficulties understand complex information. I didn't tell my family about it, didn't send an invitation, didn't mention it during our occasional polite phone calls. This was ours, mine and Milo's, something we'd built together without their input or permission. The morning of his presentation, Milo was nervous. His hands shook while getting dressed. He asked me 3 times if he was ready. "You're going to be amazing," I told him. "These people want to hear what you have to say." When his turn came, he stood at the front of the room, 14 years old, my beautiful son who they'd wanted to hide, and explained his visual system with clarity and confidence that took my breath away. He demonstrated how his method could help people organize data, understand patterns, make sense of information that seemed overwhelming. He answered questions from people twice his age with thoughtful precision. When he finished, the room applauded. Some people stood. A few came up afterward to talk to him, genuinely interested in his work. I felt a pride so overwhelming I could barely breathe. This was my child, the one they'd called an embarrassment. My mother found out about the presentation 3 days later from a cousin who'd attended. She showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, her face tight with anger, barely contained beneath a thin veneer of hurt feelings. "You didn't tell us," she said the moment I opened the door. "Milo had some big presentation and you didn't even mention it. We're his grandparents, Rowena. We had a right to be there." I stood in my doorway, blocking her entry, and felt nothing but clarity. "You wanted him out of a family photo," I said calmly. "You told me he'd ruin the picture. You suggested I put him in a facility. You called him an embarrassment." "That was years ago," she protested. "People say things when they're stressed. You can't hold that against us forever." "I'm not holding it against you," I said. "I'm just not pretending it didn't happen. You didn't want him in your spotlight when he was struggling. You don't get to claim him now that he's succeeding." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say. She stood there on my doorstep, realizing too late that consequences were real and permanent. "We made mistakes," she finally whispered. "Yes," I agreed. "You did." I closed the door gently and went back to my son. The real transformation came when Milo turned 15. a tech startup focused on accessibility tools, software designed to help people with various disabilities navigate digital spaces more easily, reached out through his mentor. They'd seen his work at several showcases. They were impressed by his unique visual processing abilities. They offered him a junior collaborative role, carefully designed to work within his capabilities and energy levels. Supervised, supported, structured around what he could do, not what he couldn't. He wouldn't be a full employee. He was still too young, still building skills. But they wanted to compensate him fairly for his contributions to their design process. His pattern recognition and visual organization abilities were genuinely valuable to their work. For the first time in his life, my son had his own income. Not much, a few $100s a month for consulting work he could do from home, but it was his. The day his first payment arrived, he took me to dinner at the restaurant he'd been saving money to try. He ordered carefully, checking prices, wanting to treat me properly. "Mom," he said over dessert, his eyes serious, "thank you for never giving up on me." I reached across the table and took his hand. "I never could have, baby. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." That night, driving home with my son beside me, I felt something I'd been chasing for 15 years finally settle into place. Peace. 3 years later, my parents' carefully constructed life began to crumble. Years of poor financial decisions caught up with them. My father's business investments failed. My mother's spending habits, the ones she'd maintained to keep up appearances, had depleted their savings. They were facing serious financial trouble. The call came on a Tuesday evening. My mother's voice was small, uncertain, nothing like the confident authority I'd grown up hearing. "We need to talk to you about something," she said. "We're having some difficulties, financial difficulties, and we were wondering if—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. My father took the phone. "We thought Milo might be able to help with some bookkeeping issues we're having. We heard he's good with organizing data and finances. We'd pay him, of course." The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. They wanted my son, the one they'd suggested I institutionalize, the one they'd called an embarrassment, the one they'd wanted removed from family photos, to solve their financial problems. They spoke his name now like they'd always cherished him, like they'd always believed in him, like the past 15 years of rejection and shame hadn't happened. I felt nothing but clarity, not anger, not satisfaction, just clear, calm understanding of exactly who they were and who we'd become without them. "I'll talk to him," I said, "but Milo makes his own decisions now." When I told Milo about my parents' request, he thought about it seriously for several minutes. "Do you think I should help them?" he asked. "That's entirely up to you," I said. "They're your grandparents, but you should know the full story before you decide." I told him everything: the photo incident, the facility suggestions, the years of distance and the sudden interest when he became successful. I'd protected him from most of it when he was younger, but he was 18 now. He deserved the truth. He listened quietly, processing, his face showing the hurt of understanding things he'd sensed, but never quite grasped. "They wanted to hide me," he said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. But now they want my help." "Yes." He sat with that for a long moment. Then he looked at me with those same brown eyes that had watched me walk away from that family photo years ago. "I don't want to work with people who didn't see my worth," he said. "I choose projects with people who believed in me from the beginning." I'd never been more proud of him than I was in that moment. When I called my parents back and relayed Milo's decision, they fell silent. The reality of what they'd lost, not just his help, but his respect, finally seemed to settle over them. Watching them absorb that truth was the cleanest justice I've ever witnessed. The conversation with my parents didn't end in screaming or accusations. It ended in quiet acknowledgement of reality. "You told me to remove him from your picture," I said calmly. "Now you want him to fix yours. Do you understand why that doesn't work?" My mother started to cry, real tears this time, not the performative kind. "We were wrong," she whispered. We were so wrong about him, about you. Yes, I agreed. You were. Is there any way to fix this? My father asked. Any way we can. You can respect his decision, I said. You can understand that relationships have consequences. You can accept that some doors close permanently when you push people out of them. They wanted forgiveness wrapped in a neat bow, instant restoration of family bonds, easy redemption that required nothing from them but an apology. But forgiveness isn't automatic. Trust, once broken so completely, can't be wished back into existence. We'd like to see him sometimes, my mother said. If he's willing, just to have a relationship. That's up to Milo, I said. He gets to choose who's in his life now. He gets to decide who deserves his time and energy. My son, the one they'd wanted to erase, now held the power to include or exclude them. The reversal was complete, and I felt nothing but peace about it. Today, our home is filled with light. Soft lamps in every corner. Windows I keep uncovered because we have nothing to hide. Milo's colorful organizational systems taped to walls, his design work displayed on screens, his certificates and awards arranged where we can both see them. He's 22 now, working full-time for the accessibility tech company that first reached out when he was 15. He earns more than I do, enough to support himself and contribute to family expenses he insists on helping with. He's thriving in ways my parents never imagined possible, in ways they never tried to imagine because they were too busy being ashamed. I work a job I love, leading programs that advocate for children and families like ours, making sure no other mother has to fight the battles I fought alone, making sure no other child gets told they're too embarrassing to be included in the family portrait. My parents exist on the edges of our lives now, looking in from the outside at what could have been theirs if they'd been willing to see my son's worth from the beginning. They send cards on birthdays. They call occasionally. Milo takes those calls sometimes when he feels like it. He's gracious but distant, willing to have a relationship but on his terms. I don't hate them. I simply don't need them. Milo asked me last year if he should forgive them fully, let them back in completely. Forgiveness is a gift, I told him, not an obligation. You can forgive someone and still maintain boundaries. You can wish them well while keeping your distance. Peace doesn't require pretending the past didn't happen. Our life now is peaceful, dignified, full of work we're proud of and relationships built on mutual respect instead of obligation. And beautifully, completely ours.